Please welcome Tom Colicchio, chef and owner of Crafted Hospitality, who has a new venture right here in Miami. Doesn't matter how many times you win the James Beard Award, every new restaurant feels like a startup. He's joined by Richard Florida.
Well, thank you guys, and thank you, Tom. This is a delight for me. Tom's resume is about as extensive as a chef's can be. He's, if not our finest chef, one of our finest chefs in this country. I've eaten, as he knows, I've eaten at all of his restaurants. In fact, the Gramercy Tavern is right across the street from my office in New York City. But not only is he a great chef, he's a fabulous entrepreneur and media personality. Top chef, best new restaurant. But what really blew me away was when I saw the announcement for your new deal with MSNBC. I was telling Tom, for a long time I've been trying to promote cities as something the media should focus on, but you've done it. You've really turned food and cuisine into something that the media, that dumbs down so many things, takes seriously. And you were telling me you've just come from Detroit. A great new restaurant coming to Miami, the greatest name ever, Beechcraft. I love it. And I'll say this, we're paisans. We're not only both from New Jersey, I'm from Newark, he's from Elizabeth, but our families come from the same region of that great country. We're from Avellino. So tell us, Tom, let's start at the very beginning. When did this bug hit you? And how did you get started?
The bug hit me when I was about 10, 11, 12. I just was fascinated with food, something that I loved, and I also found that it was something that I had, it came very easy to me. And when I was about 13, 14, my dad suggested that I think about becoming a chef. It was probably the only time I ever listened to my father. But he just saw that I had an absolute passion for it. There was just something about it. And I remember at a very early age trying to get through a recipe. Now, most likely I would have been diagnosed with ADD. And I had a hard time reading a recipe, and a hard time focusing on the steps and trying to understand what sort of this recipe was trying to get me to do. And so I remember, for some reason, the Jacques Pepin's La Technique was in my house. I didn't buy it. My father claimed my father was a correction officer in a county jail. I don't know if he got it from the library in jail. I don't know what that book would have been doing in the library in the county jail. If there was a library in a county jail, I think it was a cart that they pushed around. But I read this book, and it just completely unlocked the mystery of cooking because it was about techniques and methods, not about the recipe. And so once I understood that, then cooking really came very easy to me.
Were there models? Like, I can remember, you're a little younger than me, but 13, 14, 15, there weren't people like you. There wasn't, and I'm not saying celebrity chef. I'm talking about great chef with restaurant, with constituency.
When I decided to become, I wanted to be a chef, I think the image that most people had was a guy in a kitchen in a wife beater with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, stirring the gravy.
Yeah, the gravy.
Right.
Well, now you've come here. You've been in New York, Vegas, LA, and we've been talking about these startup ecosystems, these places that the Londons, the New Yorks, it's moving out of the suburbs where it was. Silicon Valley's coming to downtown, like Manhattan, all the tech companies, right? They were never there. And now in Chelsea, how do you start to look at a city and from a point of view of a restaurant or food scene? How do you begin to gauge the ones that are coming up and the ones that might be a good home for one of your places?
Well, in Miami, I've been looking at Miami for a while. And had offers from some various hotels here to do a deal, and nothing seemed to fit. I was really far along with the Ritz-Carlton. In the 11th hour, I decided not to do it. But what I noticed in the last couple of years is, especially in the beach, there's a lot more independent restaurants now. It's not about just doing restaurants in the hotels where it's an amenity, you have to be there. But when you have the Yardbirds and the Kong River Houses and places like that, all of a sudden you see that there are independent groups here and doing things, and there's a base for it, and people are loving it, and people are coming out for it. And that's when you see the tipping point change and say, okay, now how do we fit into this? And it's always difficult coming to a city when especially if you have a name, because obviously there's added pressure to do something great. But for me, it's never a question of how can we impose what we do on a city? It's how do we fit into that city? Because there's already a culture here. So how do we fit into that a little bit? How do we make what we do sort of become part of the fabric here and become a restaurant that the tourists coming in are going to go to because they're going to go to, but how do we get the regulars there? How do we get the locals there? How do we make sure that we become part of the city as opposed to just imposing our will on the city?
When you said something really amazing about looking at these independent restaurateurs, why? And what do you see when you see a scene, whether it's a food art, what do you see when you see this bubbling up?
Yeah, well, again, you're looking at an individual that's putting money into a location. To start a restaurant, I mean, listen, you can start a restaurant on a shoestring, and a shoestring's probably $500,000.
Not a shoestring.
Or you can spend, I mean, nowadays in New York City, it's hard to do a restaurant for under $3 million. And so now when you see, again, independents, not a hotel that has a lot of money to put into a space, but independents that are taking the risk, that tells you that there is a real business, again, not the hotel business, but a real business here. That tells you that there's infrastructure now, meaning there's great suppliers. You can buy great fish, you can get good meats, you can find cheeses, you can find not only great produce, but organic produce. When you have farms, we looked at that too. There's farms that are doing local organic food, and so things are changing. And that's when you know that again, our brand, what we stand for, what we care about, there's an audience for it.
It's interesting, I was telling you already we've begun to see a migration of artists we can trace this empirically from New York to LA, but I didn't know this. I mean, I don't know you're into this. That's a high cost of startup for a kid, right? I mean, a young person that you were, $3 million is a non-trivial chunk of change. So is that now going to inhibit the established London? I mean, they're still the greatest destinations for cuisine in the world, but or among them. Is that going to force or cause some of these younger people to migrate to a Miami or another kind of place?
Absolutely. First, if you look at New York, where all the sort of young, sort of not even up and coming, but sort of talented, they all moved to Brooklyn because it was cheaper. Now it's all going to Long Island City and Queens. Yep. But I was at a restaurant recently. Anybody been to Vagabond? Really great. Young guy, 24 years old, who's just doing amazing food. And they took a chance, the owners took a chance at him because it was a much, they wanted a cool, young, hip vibe. And this guy has got chops. And so, you're seeing that kind of talent now come to other cities. Nashville's really hot right now. Charleston's been hot for a while. Miami. And so you're seeing a lot of talent move out of New York, LA, Chicago, San Francisco. Partly it's too expensive. And number two, it's expensive not only to open a restaurant, it's expensive to live there. We have a shortage of cooks in New York now because you can't live there anymore. And so, it used to be where if you were a young, cook, you either had to come to New York, you had to do a stage somewhere in Europe, and you would either, work in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago. Now, there are great restaurants everywhere, so you don't have to, live 6 to a 400, square foot, apartment somewhere in the outer boroughs. You can live, much more cheaply and enjoy a bit of life. I mean, you're working in restaurants; it's hard work. You want to be able to enjoy yourself while you're doing it.
You were mentioning you just came back from Detroit. What did you see out there?
In Detroit, I was doing a story. As you mentioned, I started working with MSNBC, and we were doing a story on urban renewal through food. And so I went to interview the McClure brothers, who were from Detroit originally, started a pickle company in Brooklyn, and then decided it was a much better. It made much better sense from a business standpoint to move production back to Detroit. And then I spoke to a husband and wife team who are from Toronto and decided to come to Detroit because it was a lot less expensive. There is a real food revival happening in Detroit. There's a lot of urban gardening. I didn't realize this, but urban gardening started back in the late 1800s in Detroit. There was a Mayor Pingree, who just decided that it was during the Depression in the late mid to late 1800s, and he decided that one way to get people to eating better food was to start growing their own. And so there was a whole urban farming That's where it started back in the 1800s. We all think of it as new. And so I was there just trying to understand how cities can grow around food. And it hasn't aired yet. I don't know when the air date is.
Any others that you've come across? I mean, Detroit is a great example of a city rebirthing and how many of the people want to be there. And food is one of my sister-in-law's cousin. Mm-hmm. He's an artist. He's the guy who made the Frozen House.
Okay.
And he started a restaurant in downtown Detroit. Artist and wanted. But are there other examples of any other cities you've seen remaking around food, or is Detroit the best one in your view?
I think Detroit's a good example. We have a long way to go. But again, I look at Brooklyn. So much, not only restaurants, it's not only about restaurants, it's about people who want to produce something. I'm seeing more and more people these days. I just had this conversation earlier today with a guy who was doing all the landscaping at the hotel. He wants to do something with his hands. Young people, I have a 21-year-old, and all these kids, they're confused because they don't want to get on that corporate ladder and do that. But they want to make something, and they want to actually at the end of the day say, I did this. And so again, you look at what's going on in Brooklyn around food. It's the pickle makers, it's the butchers, it's people that are starting these indoor farming projects, and so whiskey makers. People want to do something, want to make a lasting impression through something that they're actually doing. They don't want to just be a cog in the machine.
And we want to consume it. Last year here, I interviewed the folks who founded this Panther Coffee here.
We use Panther, yeah.
Yeah,
sure.
and when I go to New York on 12th Street and 6th Avenue, that coffee shop, I forget the name of it, our coffee comes from Panther Coffee. And people want that, the different whiskeys. What do I like to try? I like to try, I like all the traditional stuff, but I want to try something. I think you're right, and I think maybe your industry, I told you Vitaly and I I talk about cities, he'd talk about restaurants back in the late 70s. I think your industry actually might have been the first, this making food, where there was a group of people, our cohort, that said, I'm not going to go to the corporate ladder, I'm going to go to make food. I think you're onto something about this maker, but I call them the creative class. It's a creative making class. I think you're right. And then if a city, Brooklyn is the best example of a place that created a whole environment for them. But if a city could capture this, not just people who want to talk about, who actually want to do it, it's a powerful lever for change. When you walked around Miami, you've done your due diligence, you mentioned Vagabond. We talked about, was there other places that struck you, whether it was in the food or in different kinds of spaces that you saw that exemplify this trend?
Yeah. I'll just be clear. I should have spent a lot more time down here. My schedule is such. Well. I have a couple little ones. I didn't actually walk neighborhoods as much as I'd like to. I spent some time in Wynwood. I spent some time, obviously, in the design district. But again, it's the Panther Coffee. I remember when I was shooting Best New Restaurant, and we were at our house. And we had a break, and one of the crew said, you got to go to this coffee place down the street. And I was like, yeah, coffee place, whatever. He goes, no, you have to go check this out. And so I went down there, and I was like, this Panther Coffee told me that it was time to come to Miami, because you're seeing people that, again, are making something in town. It's theirs. It belongs to them, and they're saying, we're welcome to this. This is what we're about now. And Michael Schwartz has been a friend of mine. I met Michael Schwartz, 28 years ago when he came from Philadelphia to New York to open a restaurant. So we go way back, and I've always kept in touch with him. And I've had when I'm doing my due diligence, I talked to my friends down here and said, okay, who do I need to buy from? To introduce me to the purveyors. And so it's great to have a network of people like that, Michelle Bernstein and other people like that who really kind of held my hand and got me to the opening here.
We were just in Israel and went to Jerusalem and ate at Machne Yehuda. And it was the experience of Machne Yehuda, in the market, a real restaurant that changed the whole. And now he's got a restaurant in London and exporting that. We had a frank conversation backstage about the pros and, I don't want to call them the cons of Miami, the challenges. And I think we agreed that there's a benefit, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that comes from a tourist economy. But there's also, when you're trying to establish a local thing, a scene, that those two can clash. They might not always be perfectly fit. What would you say are some of the challenges, having spent time here with an economy that both wants to grow a food scene, and it is growing a food scene, an art scene, a tech scene, and this kind of historical tourist blingy thing?
Yeah, we had the same conversation when we went to Las Vegas 15 years ago. when the idea was that, these people are transient, you're never going to see them again. And I was like, BS to that. I don't believe that. I believe that, let's just say there's a conference in town and someone's here for 5 days. Well, maybe they're not going to come back, and they may, but they're going to tell their friends, and they're going to come back for that conference next year and the year after that and the year after that. So the idea of these are people that, the tourists coming in, you'll never see them again, I don't buy that for a second. And number two, why are we catering to that? We have to cater to the people that are going to be here all the time. You got to cater to the locals. And so my feeling is, I don't care if you're coming in and spending 3 days here and we're never going to see you again, and whether or not you are driving up and you're going to come here 3 days a week. We have one goal and one goal only. People ask why you do things. We're here talking about entrepreneurship, and so you never. If you start with the why I'm doing something, and then kind of go out from there. We're here for one reason, and that's to make people happy. And I don't care if you're coming in with your family and this is a vacation that you've saved up all year for, or if you're a high roller coming in, you're going to come to Miami once a month because you want to go to the clubs. That doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is how to figure out how to make that individual happy. And so once you do that, then you can figure out what does somebody want from the experience, and then you can deliver that experience.
And from our point of view, as Miamians, in a way, what you're saying is we have to have experience that locals, that's what you're looking for, a local scene that's vibrant, but almost convert a tourist into a local.
Yeah.
So when my friends come to visit for Art Basel, who would usually spend the whole day in the convention center, I try to take them as one person to all the interesting spots. They go, that's a different city. So in our point of view is we're having people elect to come here, expose them, find ways to expose them to all the interesting things. I know there's plenty of questions for Tom, so up here. Keep your hands up so these young women can see you and get the microphones to you.
Hi. Welcome to Miami. Your
Thank you.
cousin Phil used to be my attorney.
Oh, he's coming today, actually.
Oh, good.
He's in town. I think he's arriving right about now.
Good. Just in time for cocktails. That's
You said
you
he used to be your attorney. That's not good, I guess.
I moved
He
here.
used to be mine too.
Good.
I'm a hack cook, and I love to do it. So I'm curious, maybe for the entrepreneurs, as you've grown your empire, how often do you still get in the kitchen? And you've expanded your duties. Do you? If it's not as much as it used to be, do you miss it? And what's that like to scale?
Yeah. No, I do spend time in the kitchen, and I do miss it. I was, in what I do now is for a restaurant opening. We actually didn't open yet. We opened for about 15 minutes. Beechcraft had a fire opening night. And it was not in the kitchen. There was a piece of equipment up in the ductwork that actually caught fire. And so we are not open yet. And again, we were open for about 15 minutes because it happened at 6:15. We had, besides my two little ones and my wife, we had one family in the restaurant when it happened. So I try to spend more and more time in the kitchen, but I usually do it when we're opening a restaurant. So I've been here for about almost 2 weeks now, and my plan was to stay here till around the first week in April. But I'm in the kitchen the whole time when I'm here. When I'm back home, it's kind of half and half. And that's the hard part about it. I'm a creative person, but I'm still running a business. And you actually have to, and this is, I guess, a challenge for anyone that's doing something creative but still has to run a business. I used to be able to cycle back and forth, but as we're growing, I really have to actually put a creative hat on and find that creative time, and it's usually out of my office. I literally spent, this morning carving out an hour for myself just to think and just to take time away from the business and take time away from putting out fires, and to really carve that time out for yourself. And so as you grow, you have to actually, I think, you try to cast a large net and do everything, but I think as you get to a certain point, you actually have to not only find the time, but you actually have to give up a part of what you can do or what you should do. And so for me, I always thought, if you're going to grow, especially in the restaurant business, you have to hang your ego at the door. You have to check your ego at the door, because if you think you're the only one who can do the job, guess what? You'll be the only one to do that job. And you cannot grow a company doing that. You can't grow a business doing that. So what I do is I carve time to spend time in the kitchen, because I can't move too far away from it. If I have to, make a decision between sitting in a meeting or carving time to go to the kitchen, the meeting's going to lose out. And the people who are working with me, they know this. And so so even though I do find time, I still miss it. I still have burns on my arms. So I'm never too far away from it. Yeah.
We're the first conscious plant-based food and wine festival in the United States. We take place here in Miami. And I wanted to know your thoughts on leaders like you in the food industry making plants the center of the plate in meals, which can improve America's health and the health of our environment.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I always find it's always tough because I'm waiting for someone to point a finger at me and go, well, hold on, you have 2 steakhouses in Las Vegas. And so, but no, I think it's important for a lot of reasons. I mean, obviously, it is healthier, but also high-quality proteins are becoming more and more expensive. And recently in one of my restaurants in New York, I've decided to shrink the size of the proteins and focus more on produce, which is something I've always done anyway, but really had to shrink it down because our entrees were starting to hit, $42, $43. And we were pricing ourselves out of the market. And so making a decision to shrink proteins down, but still creating flavors and from produce. I started gardening last year, and there's a part of me that wants to just focus on there's a part of me that wants to do all vegetable restaurant, and not a vegetarian restaurant, but an all vegetable restaurant, and really get these proteins down. But I think it is better for our environment, and it's better for our health. But the one reason we didn't touch on this, part of the reason I decided to go into the One Hotel is that they're making a big push to try to be as sustainable as possible in a hotel. And so there are little things that they're doing in the rooms. For instance, there's no printed materials. Everything is on the screen. Even soaps and stuff like that, we don't have them in the rooms. It's more large format, so there's less waste. So we're really trying to cut down waste. All of our food waste goes into this Orca system, which reduces everything into liquids that can go back into to be just flushed out. It turns to water. And so we're just trying to find ways to cut down waste. But then I challenged the group to say, okay, what percentage of our food is going to be organic? Not just the restaurant food, which right now we're probably at about 90%, but how much of the food in the hotel are we going to make organic, antibiotic-free? These things are important, and I think it's important for a lot of different reasons. But being a leader on some of these issues, and you're sticking your neck out, because as soon as you start talking about organics and about sustainability and about GMOs versus non-GMOs, very quickly that turns into a political conversation. And so you do end up sticking your neck out. But sometimes I think it's worth doing that.
One thing I will say is that more and more of the group I identified as the creative class identify as vegetarian, and I have a wife who's a vegetarian, or if not, want to know that when they go to a restaurant, there's an incredible...
A thoughtful option, not just an option, a thoughtful option.
A very thoughtful option, and I think it's a signal, maybe it was 20 years ago, it was the treatment of gay and lesbian people were a signal that a community... Now I think your point is very well taken, that the way we treat food and a thoughtful option speaks to a place that's kind of on the map. I think we have time for one more question, is that right? Way in the back, Tom.
Hi, my name's Christine. And I actually eat paleo, so I would love at one point for restaurants to also have that signal, so I can eat easier out. You mentioned 2 things that I think kind of transcend the restaurant discussion. One was that you carve out time for you to think, and 2, that you seem to consistently check your ego. And I'm a coach, and that's essentially what I do with my clients, is carve out a relationship in which they can do that on an ongoing basis. So I'm curious, have you yourself ever worked with a coach? And if not, what do you do personally to keep yourself on your game to operate at such a high performance level to have gotten where you are?
My coach is my wife. She constantly keeps me in check. No, I've never worked with a coach, but it's interesting. My brother's a basketball coach for high school. I coached kids at a very young age. I was a swim coach. I was a competitive swimmer from the age of 8 to 17, and found myself at the age of 16, 17, 18 coaching. And so maybe that's part of it, but No, you know, I always try to put myself in the shoes of the young cooks that are working for me, and try to understand why they're there. You know, and it's not about. I always say it's not about me. And going back to which I'm glad we didn't actually go there, but I'll throw it in now. Top Chef. When I first did the show, they asked me 3 times, and 3 times I declined to do the show until I finally sat down with the producers and with the network and said, I'll do this if this show is not about me. Because if it's about the contestants coming on, number one, these contestants are leaving their family behind, their restaurants behind. They're not allowed cell phones. They're not allowed TV. They're not allowed newspapers, magazines. They're kind of isolated. And this can't be about me or about some wise crack I'm going to make. It has to be about them. And once I understood that, then I said, okay, I'll do the show. And so, I always go back to, again, we're talking about entrepreneurship, and when I was a young cook, young cooks are very good, or any young person in your organization, they're very good at, they have this bullshit meter that's just great, and they know when they see it, and they're either going to speak out, they're going to leave, or they'll just file it away. And I used to file it away, and I say, you know what? When I have an opportunity to do a restaurant, it's not going to be all the things that I see going on wrong around me. I don't want to do that, and so. Going back to the first restaurant I had at Gramercy Tavern, I'm no longer available, no longer associated with, and I just wrote a piece for Time Magazine introducing, I shouldn't give it away, but Danny Meyer, who was my partner, and when we first got together, and I knew Danny, I met him in 1991, 1992, I approached him to do a restaurant, and that restaurant became Gramercy Tavern. But when we first got together, we didn't discuss food, our service, our decor, or the kind of art, or anything like that. We didn't talk about that at all. We talked about the kind of restaurant, the kind of business we wanted to run, the kind of people we wanted to work with. And that told me a lot about him, but it also, it showed me that it's not about how to figure out how to make money. It's not about how to figure out where you're going to fit into everything. It's really about sort of coming together and saying, what kind of business do you want to run? What kind of why are you getting into business in the first place? Are you getting into it because you love what you do? Are you getting into it because you want to make a difference? Because everything else will follow that. If you put money first, you're probably going to have a hard time making money, or you're not going to be happy doing it. And so it's one of these things where if you can create a certain happiness first, then the rest of it follows. As opposed to the other way around, is trying to figure out how through work I can make myself happy. It just works better the other way around. How do we find these moments in a day where you can say, you know what, this is working for me. So on an ongoing basis, it's like I'm not looking at, especially going through an opening. Going through an opening is great. The question early on was, they're all new. Every single restaurant is new, and there's nothing like. This is why it sucks so badly when we had a fire, because every opening, they're unique, they're never the same, and they're so exciting. To me, it's like, moments before a concert starts, or if anybody's gone to a boxing match, moments before that boxing match starts. There's a certain electricity in the air. Everyone feels it. Everyone's pulling together, and there's nothing like it. And so finding moments every single day in your business to have that kind of moment, that electricity, and find it, and that's what keeps me going. And so, no, I don't have a coach. But there's probably somewhere on my shoulder every single day a coach saying, let's look for those moments, and so that's I think that's how I keep doing it.
Tom Colicchio, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fantastic, brother.